Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here. I will indeed talk about one part of my book, which I hope will give you an overall idea of the project that I was working on, or am kind of still working on in a way. And the lecture is approximately an hour, I think, and I'm very happy to take questions, of course, after that. Swiss artist Thomas Hirschhorn's temporary, precarious monuments are praised by art historians for their simultaneous critical engagement of local audiences and an art public. Or, as American scholar Pam Lee puts the point more formalistically in her new book, Forgetting the Art World, his, quote, unruly processing of materials and manic accumulations of degraded media, end quote, which Pam Lee connects to a globalized network of overproduction and consumption. Not that the work mirrors the world descriptively, they are for Lee an, quote, occasion for a range of activities. This certainly is true. These images, yeah, thank you. These images here are taken from his latest monument in the South Bronx in New York in 2014, dedicated to the Italian communist leader and Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci. The setup is not radically different to his earlier monuments. Take, for example, the Bataille monument, built in 2002 for Documenta 10 on the outskirts of Kassel, a neighborhood known for a high rate of unemployment and desolate gray social housing, along with the biomorphic sculpture of a tree stump, which you see here. A George Bataille library invited visitors to browse books arranged by keywords like word, image, and sex. There was a biographical display about Bataille, the French philosopher, surrealist librarian, and author of several novels which were banned for pornography. Various workshops were open to all visitors. A kebab stand run by a Turkish couple from the neighborhood served fast food. A television studio allowed the locals as well as philosophers to broadcast on topics however loosely connected to Bataille. A free, here you see the library and the TV station. A free shuttle service featuring vintage Mercedes-Benzes brought visitors to the site and locals to the main art venues downtown. A webcam and website expanded access to the location for viewers outside of Kassel. Hirschhorn himself explained his work as a critique of the monument genre. The Bataille monument is a precarious, temporary art project in public space, which is erected and looked after by the youth and by inhabitants of a quarter. The Bataille monument wants to pose questions and wants to open space and time for discussions and ideas through the site, its materials, and the duration of the exhibition. The Bataille monument is a critique of the existing monument. The Bataille monument comes from below. It does not want to intimidate anyone. It is not indestructible. It is not defined for eternity. The negative connotations of monuments as static, pompous, authoritative are not new. Let us take, for example, writer Robert Musil, who in his 1936 posthumous Papers of a Living Author discussed a very interesting problem of monuments in terms of perception, which I think is very contemporary. Quote, "There's nothing in the world as invisible as monuments," he claimed. "We simply overlook traditional monumental sculpture in public space," according to the author. The statues of great heroes and formerly famous poets are mysteriously silent. Worse, we throw, as he says, the great heroes and formerly famous poets with a stone around their necks into the sea of forgetting. The sentence just cited is quoted often in defense of contemporary participatory art or social practice. The brief text, which was in fact first delivered as a talk in 1927, puts great emphasis on the monument's need for attention from an audience. And that is because the audience is a monument's target. The job of monuments, according to Musil, is to kickstart commemoration, to, as he says, grab our attention and give our feelings a pious direction. And at this, Musil, this their main business, monuments fail always. Musil sees the function of the monument thus as social through and through, a function obscured by focus of a few great art monuments of the past that people seek, as he says, with Baedeker in hands, like the Venetian Colleone and the Paduan Gattamelata. These rare first-rate monuments function much like advertising, which knows its audience well, claims Musil. At least, he suggests innocently, statues could clap their eyes open and shut or bear slogans like, Goethe's Faust is the best. This would prevent what he calls an oil-on-water effect, wherein our attention slides off them like water off a duck's back as we race through the city. But Musil is not so innocent. His example of a successful modern monument is the collection of Bismarck monuments scattered throughout Germany, and I'm showing here like what a random Google search would give you. Because he says they are forming a kind of a union, a Verein of nationalist objects. What Musil is thus criticizing is less the inadequacy of immortalized action than the monument builder's inability to exploit social function. And as the Bismarck example shows, this has less to do with the attention-grabbing gimmicks than the capture of the audience in social bonds. So here you could argue that the multiplication, the repetition, the recognition factor, the similar forms kind of do the job that could potentially exploit the social function. Musil's account is, of course, surprisingly early. After the Second World War, the aversion against monuments and the monumental in general became mainstream in avant-garde circles, and it resonates in Hirschhorn's rhetoric. Authoritatively installed from above, oblivious to its site, and socially dysfunctional or ineffective. Similar consideration, voiced by critics in the wake of World War II, led to demands that statues be replaced by gardens to walk in, community centers, or cubist dispersals of form under the slogan of living memorials. Hirschhorn too, as he says, quote, does not want to work for an exclusive public, as a local newspaper quotes him. And further, in the newspaper, he wants to include and connect people, a noble thought, the journalist continued, not without a hint of irony. In reminding you of the historical discourse that informs Hirschhorn's project, I do not mean that there's nothing new under the sun. For instance, the cars were auctioned on eBay, signed by the artist, which brings up questions of economy, authorship, or even speculation in socially oriented art. We can then describe the Bataille monument as a temporarily and physically distributed event, to an extent no living memorial was. Taking this idea seriously, one would have to consider the artist's statement, the newspaper interview and the resulting article, and other such acts and objects part of the monument, partaking in its social goal. Indeed, such a way of reading the publicity around the monument is hardly against the grain, since the press statements in question fit the artist's requirements for a monument from below. I also do not object to the historical genealogy drawn by Hirschhorn and his critics, which runs from constructivist sculpture to the social plastic or social sculpture of Joseph Beuys. What I'm not happy with is the short circuit from interaction and non-art materials to effective social action. In short, I'm claiming that social practice has to know its tools and its format. Hirschhorn's work is unthinkable, though, apart from the historical process of rapprochement of public art to the live art of the 1960s, with its anarchic but carefully planned and documented street actions. In my broader research, I show that 1960s performance, a supposed antipode to the monument in its temporality and embodiment, in fact held the key to its revival as supposedly democratic community builder. To see how performance could do this, how it could become the monument, one has to let go, though, of two assumptions about live art. First, its objectless ephemerality, and two, its naturally non-coercive character. The ephemerality claim has come under pressure in recent performance studies, with its focus on reenactments, reperformances, and the general retrospective spirit of much performance art today. Less explored, I think, is the social power of performance. Its centrality for public art lies in its ability to trip the invisible wires of power, or to use less metaphorical language, its appropriation, subversion, and direct challenge to conventions of public conduct, which affects us as subjects as well as political actors. After the precarious, ephemeral exhibition of Hirschhorn, for example, has ended, there remain individuals who remember having participated in or encountered the work, and documents and artifacts that recorded its presence. The public statements of Hirschhorn's projects and press clips that seemed so action-like a moment ago immortalized the project as they enter libraries and archives and are cited by historians, like me, for example. This element of permanence, or at least extended duration, brings back with it some of the function and authority of the classic monument. At the very least, it tells us how to see monuments, Kassel and Hirschhorn's intervention there, whose print discourse defines it, if not for eternity, for long enough. The tricky issue, though, in the tension between ephemeral action and permanence are authority and agency. We want the latter, but without authoritarian author of history. The key moment for these developments are the 1970s, when old and new forms of public art coexisted, when performance art merged with mediation in early video art, and concepts such as experience were hotly debated. However, it would be wrong to claim that objects carry a more democratic approach per se. The issue is much more complex. A quote by American critic Lucy Lippert from a text from the 1970s is telling. Lippert makes clear that the problem of monuments is not the old-fashioned form. As a reaction to the newly established Public Art Fund in New York that commissioned, for example, Alexander Calder, which you see here, and you see a photo of Lucy Lippert, as an attempt to confront a broader public with abstract modern art, she insisted on the integration of communities. So what happened in America during that time was that there was like a certain percentage of the public art fund was committed to bringing abstract contemporary modern art to the people, and Calder was one of the most prominent examples. Lippert claims what is needed is the spreading not down but out of an art that rises up from the experiences of the people who are living with it, rather than an art patronizingly imposed from above. The experience can thus not be imposed, it has to come, according to Lippert, from the community. However, Lippert had to navigate carefully. After all, Calder and other modernists were disliked by conservatives, and she had to make sure that her point came across not as criticism of modern art or as call for bad community art. She therefore clarifies. If public art is indeed to be public, it must be able to engage at least a portion of its audience at the core of its own experience, and at the same time to extend this experience. The extension, of course, is the crucial point, but also the hardest to achieve. The 1970s, I think, are interesting as a turning point in the genre of monumental sculpture and of commemorative objects in the midst of a heated debate about the public sphere at a time of increasing mediation of society. In Germany, the discourse was in some parts similar, in some, particularly in the connection to media, very different. The outspoken theorists of the public sphere, Oskar Negt and Alexander Kluge, merged utopian Marxism with a belief in the mobilization of the people through mass media. Kluge was a filmmaker, committed to changing film and television production in the Federal Republic. Indeed, Kluge's first film was a brief documentary on National Socialist architecture entitled Brutality in Stone, in grand pictures retelling the complicity of monumental architecture and authoritative abuse of power. Their joint book, Public Sphere and Experience, is an answer to Jürgen Habermas's book, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere from 1962, and discusses the construction of the public sphere in terms of class-bound experiences, which they claim Habermas had neglected, some of which opened the way to history, if only because a collective experience comes about over time. So the claim is that if you are bound to a certain class, you have a particular experience of the public sphere, and that this needs to be taken into account, and we therefore have to always talk about different public spheres rather than one potential homogeneous public sphere. So one public sphere as such is not possible. There's an interesting appendix in the book on monuments, titled programmatically The Public Sphere of Monuments. The subtitle, Public Sphere and Historical Consciousness, indicates that the expectations for public art and the model within which they are to be met, namely the construction of alternative public spheres in which proletarian experience can find space. Monuments are, as in Museum, as such found coercive but ineffective. Unlike Musil, however, Knecht and Kluge cannot think of any contemporary monument that works. So they reach back to the golden age of Russian constructivism for a positive counterexample. Vladimir Tatlin's model for the monument to the Third International is essentially their ideal, and as they saw it, embodied an important perspective of the sensual implementation of historical consciousness. The tower, which should have housed the legislative and the propaganda ministry in rotating structures, functioned as kind of a state advertisement center. So you had, this is a model, it was never built, but you essentially had different, like a cube and different forms that would rotate, and you would have the radio station, the state radio station in there, and the propaganda ministry, and so on and so forth. And you could also, through, like an audio, like would essentially also be an audio installation, because you could broadcast right into public space. In the spirit of 1968, Knecht and Kluge insisted that a monument be anchored in the present and engage its audience sensually. This means that the present and history could coexist. In fact, there were predecessors that remained unmentioned by Knecht and Kluge. For example, I'm saying post-revolutionary festivals, and I'm showing here one of the post-revolutionary festivals of the French Revolution, but they also existed after the Russian Revolution, had meticulously staged feasts, reenactments, processions, and other experiential forms of commemorating their revolutionary events. It is less important that the past be represented accurately than that in representing it, participants commit themselves to its politics. This performative model is at the heart of my thesis, understood as a historical shift from seeing monuments as outdated authoritarian machines to harnessing their social potential, the involvement of the audience in a social bond intended to instill historical consciousness. Let us take the German debate one step further. The real geographic and political state, with its catastrophic history, can be read as the subtext of the debate, such is my claim, with the not to be spoken about concept of the nation in the background. Particularly interesting is the German pavilion of the 1976 Venice Biennial, whose contributions revolve around nation and nationality without mentioning them, addressing not directly but through rather abstract options of conceptual site specificity issues of the public sphere and of the monument. Two of the three artists working in that pavilion, Jochen Gerz and Josef Beuys, became prominently engaged in public art. Beuys coined the new, now global practice of social sculpture, while Gertz became the leading designer of what American scholar James Young called counter-monuments. Since 1895, the Biennale in Venice had maintained a system of national pavilions and commissioners. The German pavilion belonged to the Federal Republic at the time. East Germany did not exhibit in Venice until the early 1980s, and then not in that pavilion. The 1976 contributions show the constructive frictions, even failures, in merging identity and politics through forms of social sculpture. German artists of a generation that transcended national boundaries in their commitment to their art and ideas, in the words of German art dealer Konrad Fischer, or at least tried to do so, were put in the unenviable position of self-presentation as Germans. And this is, I think, still a problem if you go to Venice. The Germans are always kind of working against their national identity. The architecture of the pavilion added to the historical burden. Its neoclassical facade, built in 1909, had been adjusted to National Socialist taste in 1938, with heavy piers and the addition of the massive inscription Germania, which was the name Hitler intended for the city of Berlin after the war. Joseph Beuys' tram stop, a tall composite column, Jochen Gertz, the centaur's difficulty when dismounting the horse, the hollow wooden horse, and I show you the third one, Rainer Rutenberg's doorway, essentially holding pen made of rubber ropes, show first attempts not to express but to generate historical consciousness, to invent forms of commemoration as a social practice equal to the task of addressing the fascist past. In Venice, though, the tools are still being developed, as we see. Beuys' Straßenbahnhaltestelle or tram stop, placed in the main hall of the pavilion, was subtitled Monument for the Future, an odd but significant phrase if we reflect that every monument qua memorial refers to the past, with a particular present agenda, of course. But Beuys' monument is not to the future, but for the future. Not the monument's subject matter, but its use is being rethought. Tram stop took as its point of departure a war monument from the 17th century, which we see on this side here, sometimes called a monument to peace, in the German city of Kleve, where Beuys grew up. Beuys cast what was left of the monument with several additions and he also positioned a tramway track on the floor of the pavilion, along with a crank used to move tracks. In addition, he drilled into the floor of the pavilion, excavating rubble, which allegedly, or so such goes the rumor, was left over from the old Venice Campanile, which collapsed in 1902. And I always thought that was a really weird story, but supposedly because one would assume they would use the stones to rebuild it, but there is a historical narrative where the stones were then put towards the Giardini, and the new Campanile does not have the same stones. These heterogeneous geographical and chronological origins made the work difficult to read. German newspaper critics lamented the need for a manual or a pavilion guide to make sense of the symbolism. Tram stop connected Baroque Kleve, the Kleve of Beuys' childhood, and the history of Venice. But what historical narrative could reconcile all these layers? Or maybe it is the unavoidable mixture and lack of narrative in one's own memory what Beuys intended the future to be. Or the optimistic postmodern claim that a contemporary monument in its anachronism suspends time and national boundaries. The act of reproducing and altering a monument may be a comment on the ever-changing nature of monuments, a modernist theme first made explicit by Alois Riegel at the turn of the 20th century. How do we pare down this swarm of competing interpretations so typical of Beuys' projects? By the time he came to Venice, Beuys had operated at the intersection of performance and sculpture for over a decade, theorizing his endeavor as social plastic, soziale Plastik, a term he preferred over sculpture for its implication of a malleable material to be shaped. Soziale Plastik spanned human activities from breathing, thinking, and political action to traditional art production and the hyperactive emission of ephemera in the manner of fluxes, all seen as means of shaping the environment to social ends. At the same time, he paid meticulous attention to the material qualities of his preferred media, notably fat, felt, wax, and bronze. This allowed Beuys to present objects and performances as part of the same stream of activity, which he insisted on portraying as political agitation. In the Biennale catalogue, Gallwitz, the curator of the pavilion, thus claimed tram stop as an action. Quote, since the aim was to re-establish and to restore history, end quote. The use of rubble hints that the monument is ephemeral, both ontologically as an object that can be destroyed and epistemologically, for without spectators it falls into oblivion. If tram stop is a meditation on the extra-human limits on historical consciousness, how is the massive assembly of bronze and stone rubble legible as an action? The key, I think, is Beuys' use of photographs of the installation process. These foreground the bodies of Beuys and the laborers, working, resting, conversing, baptizing the monument, as in this image. We can read them through the tradition of performance photography and films, for example, Hans Namuth's famous photographs and film of Jackson Pollock. In the Venice photos, the impressive and characteristic figure of Beuys orchestrates the event. Most striking, though, are the photos by Bubi Durini. One particular striking image shows the cannon column with Beuys behind it, only his arms visible. He visually merges with his piece, at once Pygmalion and Galatea, male creator and precarious monument action. As if underlining the force of this image, Beuys silk-screened it for a poster shown in Bologna in 1977 with his signature above the welded head, and used it for a silk-screened numbered edition of 150 published by Durini's wife, the gallerist Lucrezia di Domizio. Beuys' monument may be unstable metaphorically, but his photographic identification is full of authority. It turns the past into an action that it then celebrates. The event character Beuys wanted was emphasized when Tram Stop was purchased by the Kröller-Müller Museum in Otterlo shortly before the Biennale opened. Beuys sold it under the condition of a new display regime. The cannon was to be shown only horizontally after the Biennale ended, which provoked art critic Werner Spies to ask whether Beuys had in mind Gustave Courbet's demolition of the Vendôme column during the Paris Commune. The analogy, if justified, indicates in the trope of artist as destroyer of absolute monuments a disjunction in Tram Stop between the past, vulnerable and heterogeneous, and the present, wherein the past is forcefully conjured. In laying the column flat, Beuys stressed that the future is not in the object, which was demoted to a relic of a past performance, but in those acting on it. The problem is that interaction is arrogated to the artist. Beuys replaces the authority of the past with the authority of authorial stipulation, turning the monument into a performance document. The context of the museum, in fact, fossilizes the social sculpture into a relic. Jochen Gerz's first comments after the visit to the Giardini in November 1975 show how quickly he identified the question of nation and political persuasion with the history of the pavilion. I quote, "The pavilion is not a halfway thing, architectonic blitzkrieg. You get the feeling the whole thing has been lying on an oak desk in Berlin and was sent down wham bam by phone. Only even measurements, door 223, no details, bunker." Geertz's view of art as a weapon and of the somehow permanent performance of aggression in the pavillon's architecture becomes the subject of his installation. The centaur's difficulty when dismounting the horse. The centaur, resembling in fact a hollow wooden horse, was installed in 2 adjacent rooms in the left wing of the building, with most of the abdomen and rear of the horse in one room, and the other body in the other. The ceiling of the building cut off the sculpture at the neck, or so it appeared. In fact, there was no head. Its belly was accessible by a ladder between the rear legs, which can be seen tucked under the belly, and we can see it here. The visual reference is to the Trojan horse, with the intruder, the man part of the centaur, played by Geertz himself, who claims in his diary or journal to have lived inside the sculpture for a couple of days. The allusion in this historically dense work are literary but threatening. In seeming to celebrate the ploy that ended the Trojan War, Geertz positioned the horse as a destructive, even self-destructive element inside the architecture. The Aeneid tells how the Trojans dismantled their own city wall to get the horse inside, suggesting that they were partly responsible for their fate. Is the centaur an imaginative invitation to dismantle the pavilion, the real monument, or a threat of architectonic blitzkrieg from the official German artist? It is hard to decide. Geertz's hostility to both pavilion and his role as public artist is summed up in the metaphor of the trap meant to destroy the city and its inhabitants. This ambiguity implicates the viewer in the functioning of the monument. In passing Geertz's metaphors, we must take our places imaginatively as the authors or the victims of violence. So we have to decide what we think the sculpture could do or who is the actor. Given this directness of address, it should not come as a surprise that Geertz came to sculpture out of performance in public space. In his 1968 work, Attenzione, l'arte corrompe, he affixed labels with the slogan, "Attention, art corrupts," on Italian landmarks, including the copy of Michelangelo's David in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. It's, of course, the most liked photograph of the series for obvious reasons. This action, preserved wholly in photographs, is skeptical of the monument and its reception in tourism, but it also pokes fun at fears of corruption informing anti-monument discourse. Attenzione, l'arte corrompe operates at this intersection of language, anonymous performance, and monument. What is new is the fixing and monumentalizing of performance through a photograph, which perpetuates Geertz's interventions in public space, much in the way that Beuys would commemorate his own action at Venice. Geertz's mature work can be seen as a long-term effort to restore a shared practice of dispute to the public monument. His project used written language not because of its presumed anti-aesthetic properties, as in conceptual art, but because of its extra-aesthetic appeal as a shared medium of communication. The question of German self-representation in Venice, through Unanswered, brought forward new combinations of bodies and monuments. These are seen for the first time not as opposed but as complementary forces in social practice. The pavilion of the mid-1970s was an ideal site for this struggle, for it represented not simply art institutions, but a phantom Germany, split by the Cold War and perpetually revolving around an unresolved past. The key step not taken in Venice, but carried out later by Geertz and other artists in Europe and elsewhere, notably maybe in the United States by Maya Lin in the 1980s, is the delegation of the performance to the audience. You probably all know the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where people essentially go and commemorate the death of their family members or people they had known by taking a piece of paper and rubbing off the name. Practices since the Renaissance teach us that audiences have always acted around in response to and with monuments. And I show here as an example the Roman Pasquino, also called talking statue, which has been used for affixing pamphlets against the Pope and the state for many centuries. The innovation of what became known as the 1980s counter-monument was to recognize and codify this audience reaction as part of what the monument itself sought to achieve. The most prominent example is Jochen Gerz and Esther Schalew-Gerz's monument against fascism in Hamburg, which is essentially a suburb. It's a suburb of Hamburg, but it has its own city status. The monument was erected in 1968 as a simple square column, 20 meters high, surfaced in lead. Jochen Gerz won a closed competition with a monument that presupposed its eventual disappearance. The concept is simple, begins Gerz's first letter to the city. A text presented in 7 languages and placed on a plaque next to the column was to address visitors and passers-by to scratch their names into the surface with a steel board. And this is the text. We invite the citizens of Hamburg and visitors to the town to add their names here to ours. In doing so, we commit ourselves to remain vigilant. As more and more names cover this 12-meter-tall lead column, it will gradually be lowered into the ground. One day, it will have disappeared completely, and the site of the Hamburg monument against fascism will be empty. In the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. Vandalism occurred against the column only weeks after the inauguration. I'm showing here a couple of pro-fascist sentiments, racist comments, and swastikas appeared. Some of the signatures were even scratched out. The column was even shot, as you see in one picture. Nevertheless, it was lowered into the ground as planned in 8 installments over the course of 7 years. In the Anglophone monument discourse, the Hamburg column is a paradigm case of the counter-monument, a term coined by American scholar James Young for this distinct species of memorial art. Young sees here a decisive break in the form and politics of the monument. And this is how he defines it. A monument against fascism, therefore, would have to be a monument against itself, against the traditionally didactic function of the monuments, against their tendency to displace the past they would have us contemplate, and finally, against the authoritarian propensity in monumental spaces that reduces viewers to passive spectators. The crucial first claim is that a monument against fascism is a monument against itself. By extension, we get the orthodox post-war view of the monument as essentially fascist. Though Young does not cite Knecht and Kluge, the claims made on behalf of Gerz's work are resonant to the German theoretical debate since the 1970s. The counter-monument offers to combat just those features which Knecht and Kluge despised in public art. The term success has overshadowed the complexity of the practice it identifies. In particular, the target of the counter is misunderstood, I think. Counter-monument implies that the problem in question is the genre of the monument, rather than a changed social context, and in Germany, a past that can only be confronted critically. These challenges required not new objects freed of old attributes, but a change in the practice of commemoration, in particular its purpose. In focusing attention on objects, the term also shuts out the manifold contributions of performance and conceptual art in producing these monuments. The most important question is, though, what is left of the monument's force, with didacticism and authority gone? If counter-monuments are a critique of nationalist commemoration, what gives them the authority to mount such a critique? I think if we want to develop a functioning model of how to discuss and evaluate current public art and commemorative practice, we need to reconsider key works, such as the Monument Against Fascism, as social practice rather than as counter-monument. But how can a monument act socially? I start with the monument critical aspect emphasized by Young. Gerz himself subtitled the Hamburg Memorial Gegendenkmal, usually rendered anti-monument, but in fact also a counter-monument, in order to mark his detachment from traditional celebratory memorials. Yet the very call and the selection of candidates for the Hamburg Commission had excluded as unfit traditional monuments. This was to be a monument against something, and those allowed to compete in the competition were mainly former sculptors turned performance artists or consistent art refusers, as one of the competitors called himself. How to interpret the vandalism, though? Every signature, as well as every swastika that appeared on the column, served as a transcript of performances enacted on or against the column. The vandalism was neither welcome nor unexpected. In his first proposal, Gertz already anticipated uninvited reactions. Of course, it can happen that citizens and visitors write other things on the column than their names, for example, pro-fascist slogans. This does not bother me. The monument is a relevator, not a false piety, a photograph of the city as it really is, not how it imagines itself or in its Sunday best. Contemporary sculpture often provokes only graffiti. Why not turn the tables and make use of the writing as testimony? The column, imagined as a photograph of its social surroundings, points to the intersection of the monument and the document that has proven so important in the history of post-war performance and public art. Performance is also a historical form of art, operating with the memory of its occurrence, aided by photographic documents. What we do is to reimagine the performance, often in a canonical, meaning historically approved form, at least once we have press, art historical interpretations, and the artist's own version of what they saw happened. The importance of the document as metaphor is equally crucial in the work of Gertz. Indeed, the Hamburg Memorial can be regarded as a document written and read by the public, whether as photograph revealing the city we have stopped seeing, or as modernist monolith defaced by local youth. The monument is no longer a tool of propaganda, but a political lightning rod, making inarticulate tensions visible. It is, despite the rhetoric of objectivity, not a neutral recording of public opinion, but a critical survey, one that, declaring its own stance, takes stock of the agreement and disagreement it provokes. The documentary function explains why part of the submerged column remains visible. This is how it looks today. So essentially the column was on top there, and this is entrance to a subway station. And here you have a small window through which you can see the submerged column. So you can see the column through a sealed glass window in the hollowed-out base of the monument, resembling the exhibition of a geologically interesting stratum of the Earth's past. In addition to the peephole, documentation panels were installed near the window and on the platform with photographs of the successive lowerings to supplement the text of the invitation. In the decades since the Hamburg Memorial, performative monuments have entered institutional mainstream, which does not mean that traditional monumentality has disappeared. Sometimes they work together even. The 1980s and 90s can retrospectively generally be characterized as obsessed with memory and memorials, with the search to involve the audience directly into history, to allow for the fragmented and partial subjective view on the past. This went together in Europe and the United States with calls for remembrance of victims of the state and its inhabitants' wrongdoings, from the colonial period to the Vietnam War. And with it came the need for new forms. There's nothing to say in theory against this particular mode of interaction. After all, it is related to a turn in historical consciousness in which the master narrative was replaced by histories from below, allowing the individual to take their part in history, and with it take responsibility as well. The issue that is problematic circles around the function of the bodily involvement in such performative monuments. In short, what was contractual in Gertz, kind of an offer to act and essentially like a real signature as if we were signing a contract, as a reaction in the present to history, an active communication with that history, has more and more become dehistoricized. The body, again, thought of as essential, not as potentially mediated and therefore connected to history. Even a work as promising as Peter Eisenman's Holocaust Monument in Berlin openly embraced buzzwords such as labyrinth, destabilization of the body, and possible disorientation. Much was made of the width between the stones, I'll show you a detail, which was to prevent that people could walk next to each other. History gets lost in this narrative, and with it the knowledge of the purpose of the monument. Why am I being destabilized? What to make of the labyrinth? In the case of Eisenman, an information center was requested by the politicians to balance the more corporeal experience. But in some other cases of the last few years, the subjective activation of a bodily memory instead of commemoration, which I would define as public, is the focus. Spanish artist Santiago Serra has addressed this problem with a project that is one of the least liked projects concerning the Holocaust, but, as I argue, precisely points to the problem of re-experiencing history through the body if the historical dimension gets lost. His 2006 project, 245 cubic meter, installed in the former synagogue in Stommeln, Germany, consists of the exhaust of 6 cars being discharged through tubes into the sealed buildings. So that means essentially he filled the synagogue with toxic gas. Visitors had to wear gas masks and were allowed inside the synagogue for 5 minutes each. A protest promptly followed across the political spectrum, most outspokenly from the Secretary General of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, who said the piece, quote, damaged the dignity not only of Holocaust survivors, but of the whole Jewish community, end quote. The exhibition, planned to be open to visitors for several hours every Sunday, was shut down prematurely. No doubt one can say that in any political context, the installation was tasteless, immature, and appalling in its clumsy attempt to submit the visitor to the experience Holocaust victims had lived through, or rather, most vulgar of all, to the experience of death by gassing. The vulgarity of the attempt, of course, beyond the question whether one should wish to simulate such an experience, is that it's not an experience that can be had. What one gets by analogy is the passive passion of having been the tourist at a genocide. The shock value of 245 cubic meter acquires its full significance, however, in the context of the statements concerning his intentions that Sierra released to the press. The work, it turns out, is no act of commemoration, but rather aims at exposing the, quote, banalization of remembrance of the Holocaust, end quote. One might almost say, to borrow a rhetorical strategy we have witnessed frequently in this narrative, he made a counter-monument to Holocaust commemoration. And if his work is self-consciously unacceptable, the gist of Serra's claim is that recent Holocaust commemoration is, or has become, itself a trivial abuse of history, indistinguishable from the most traditional of monuments. We must admit that the venue was particularly well chosen for such a claim to have its bite. The synagogue in Stommeln, near Cologne, had served as a medium for site-specific installations since the early 1990s, when the Municipal Kulturverein began inviting prominent artists to the only synagogue in the area that had survived the National Socialists, and the building had been bought by the city in the late 1970s. Stommeln has thus gained an international reputation. To mention only one project, 1998, Rebecca Horn executed Spiegel der Nacht, Mirror of the Night, a poetic Holocaust memorial based on the writing of based on the German reception of Paul Celan's writings, in which images of night, mirrors, ashes, and desolate landscapes are taken as melancholy entry points to subjective commemoration. In denigrating the subjective approach to Holocaust commemoration in general, Serra launches a critique addressing the exuberance of aesthetic offers to get involved in the Holocaust. Let us examine how this interaction is offered up and at the same time rendered obscene by Sarah. The visitor to Stommern in 2002 was to walk into the gas-filled space with a gas mask that prevented injury and no other access to the subject of commemoration. So presumably it required some courage to actually walk into the space. Once inside, you could not see anything than you would without the gas. One could only peer through the pier at the synagogue and leave. On-site discussions were impossible because of the mask, as was any possible action beside the potentially suicidal one, of course, of taking off the mask. In short, I want to argue that what Sarah mercilessly exposed in Stommern is not that all commemoration or performative commemoration as such is a problem. Essentially, he himself relied on the performative potential. But what he criticized was a mode of commemoration that seeks to put passive spectators in the victim's shoes or to evoke emotional reactions on the basis of such second-hand experience. In this sense, 245 cubic meters may in fact succeed in being a radical critique of the cathartic element in commemoration, including, of course, itself. The tightrope walk is between engaged involvement, I think, in generally, which ideally makes for an active and responsible subject towards the history that is being addressed, and ahistorical spectacle of mere bodily submission to history, or even of touristic consumption thereof. The question remains if empathy is enough, or if we need responsibility. My last example is very different, and it's from, I'll show you, this is just another, this maybe is interesting, this is how Sarah shows the remnants of the project in a retrospective. The pictures is a different project, so he just showed the ropes that he used to get the gas inside the building. And it looked like which is often the case with his works, it looked like a perfectly innocent post-minimalist, site-specific installation. So my last example, though, is Marina Abramovic, The Spirit of Mozart, which was built in 2004 in Salzburg, and I'm from Salzburg, that's why I'm showing it. It consists essentially of a 50-meter high steel chair and 8 steel chairs of normal dimensions, which can be sat upon, but not moved, placed in rows before the very tall chair. The work is officially described as interactive, the audience being invited to take part in the performance, essentially to take a seat. There's a formal resemblance, of course, to the artist's transitory objects of the 1980s and 90s, which were sculptures made of massive materials like stones and so on, and iron shaped into shoes, chairs, and other usable objects. Despite the psychoanalytical term transitional objects, which sound similar, Abramovic's transitory objects are themselves the subjects of change. They are, as she says, to trigger physical or mental experiences among the public through direct interaction. When the experience is achieved, this is still a quote, the objects can be removed, end quote. That this is done in durable material suggests that for Abramovic, ephemerality is more a matter of use and experience than of physical essence. In Salzburg, the work is meant to last, though it was moved, but the interaction promised is ambiguous, if not impossible. There's nothing to interact with but the inaccessible chair of Mozart, which only a giant could mount. That and the city, of course. This double strategy of distancing and myth formation is pertinent to all of Abramovic's work. So I should like to end with a question raised at the start. I would like to ask with a different question. How do art and context come together? The hierarchy in the Mozart monument is obvious. Through it, Abramovich reveals a problem with democratic commemoration as much as with co-presence in a performance. In both cases, spectators have to act, at the least to take responsibility for subjective acts. The Salzburg audience cannot perform anything but its lack of access. This constraint is as firm as Mozart's chair is unreachable. One can look at the sky and concede his genius. And the explanatory text assures us that Abramovich is a fan of Mozart's music. And yet, there's also advice. And she says, sit down on the chair, close your eyes, look inwards, lose track of time. This hint of irony is the only reminder that a monument's function is to reflect on history, not to take its place. Thank you.